Welcome to the Talking Toughness series of podcasts, where we examine the mental toughness concept with guests from a wide range of sectors, illustrating that our mental approach to what happens to us and around us matters for all of us. Our guests come from the worlds of business and public service, education, social mobility, sport, and health. They all share their experiences and their observations about the factors that have enabled them to survive and to thrive on their journey through life. Many guests have gone further and incorporated the concept into what they do as coaches, trainers, managers, and leaders, helping others to thrive in their turn. Their experiences are valuable to those of us who strive to do the same. Our guest today is Gordon Ryan, a chartered psychologist who has become an authority in understanding and working with those employed in first responder services, especially police services, a sector where he is in demand all over the world. This provides him with access to people and organisations who, in addition to the normal everyday stressors and pressures of fulfilling a role, accept a unique set of stressors few of us will see or experience. And there's a lot of learning in that, which can be applied to everything we do. In the first part, Gordon explores the world of the police service. What are its unique features and how mental toughness is fundamentally relevant to that world. In the second part, we also explore teamworking and togetherness. As Gordon has observed and points out, there is a potentially damaging downside to togetherness, which too often emerges in cultures where being part of the team is highly prized. Now, we've known Gordon for many years and have come to appreciate his thoughtful approach to his work. He learns all the time, and as you will now hear, he's happy to share with us what he learns. Well, good morning, Gordon, and how are we this morning?
I'm well, Doug. Thank you very much. After a weekend of mountain biking, I've got a few bumps and bruises from falling off, but hopefully my mental toughness will get me through some of that towards this weekend and get me back on track. But otherwise, very well. Nice to see you.
Well, it's good to see you, and I think you need your mental toughness to get on a bike as well. Mine fall off.
And nice to see John as well. Nice to see you, John.
Yeah, great to meet you, Gordon. We've not met before, so yeah, really interested to get chatting. And
Well, Gordon, you've got a really interesting sort of career path. You've worked in an area that is uh, growing in interest, I would say, and that's the world of the first responder. We talk there about police, fire services, ambulance, and so on. And we've always understood that that's kind of a tough world, but we're beginning to become more and more aware about how many people just topple over who are working in that world. So perhaps we can kick off by getting your perspective on what are the stressors in that world. And I know you've got particular interest in the police services, so you might want to illustrate it with that.
Yeah, and I think, Doug, probably the police service is not unique in that sense, in that first responder world. I think there's some common features of the things that become stressors in those first responder type environments, and maybe not just even in the response world, but there's that part of all of those services which isn't response, but are still high stressor type working environments. And so the things I think are probably common are, on the one hand, role clarity. I think, people knowing exactly what their role is and what's expected of them, I think is one source. I think one of the other sources is the level of support that are around the people who are, if you like, the frontline first response people. Um, and one of the challenges there, and I'll use policing to illustrate this, is there's a high proportion of first line managers who are quite young in service now. And that's not that they are good or bad people. It's just because of the way in which the recruitment cycles have worked and promotion cycles have worked. There's a high proportion of in policing sergeant level who are reasonably young in experience. So the fact that they're they're in that first line supervisory role quite early in their career, having only probably just cemented themselves in terms of capability to deliver the role at constable level. They're then taking on that thing of supporting other people, which is a great thing on the one hand, but on the other hand, if they had a little more experience, might they be able to be focused on what it means to be a first line supervisor, supporter, manager a little bit better? And again, I probably think that's probably not unique. You probably see that quite a lot in the health service as well. Nurses with not a lot of experience making it into sort of managing teams and things like that. So I think that's a stressor. And then there's the very nature of the work itself. Some of the work, it can be quite emotionally challenging. So going to traumatic incidents, but again, there's also that physical environment of potentially being assaulted. And again, that's not unique to policing. I think social workers, healthcare workers, fire service, all probably, and ambulance staff all experience those things as well.
Yeah, I've always had this kind of interest in. It's a great point you raised, Gordon, but I mean, I was interested in how early it came in notifying it as a stressor, that sense of having responsibility for others. You can see those times. Obviously, we talk about mental toughness and the buffering effect, and I think that illustrates quite well where that buffer exists. Like almost like if you only have sufficient resource to be able to handle your own stresses during the day, and someone else comes to you, you just think, "Oh, not now, can't handle this." And so, what kind of training would those young people moving into supervisory positions get in order to? It's not just about the supervising, is it? It's how do we actually help you to use less of your own resource dealing with, your own stuff?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of things that make me just think that one of them is that being a supervisor is one step in the direction of having a responsibility for other people, as you kind of mentioned there, John. But the other part of that is also where you start to take responsibility for less experienced team members, even before you become a supervisor. So as a more senior shift member, maybe, or as somebody who is supporting people through their own sort of probationary periods and learning at that initial stage, there is a tendency to move towards being the more experienced team member before becoming necessarily a first line supervisor. And so when we think about a third of the police service has less than 5 years experience, which is quite an interesting sort of statistic in the sense that it's a 30+ year career. So there's different lengths of careers now, but it's more than 30 years. But when you look at the statistics, a third of them have got less than 5 years experience. The support that's given to people in terms of moving into supervisory positions varies force by force, to be honest. Some of the better forces actually do a training programs to try to prepare people into those roles. Some people are promoted into them and may get no training at all. Again, not an unusual thing. I think the statistic I read recently about first line supervisors, there's approximately 80% of people who go into first line supervisory roles, not just in policing, but generally, that never have any training. And so I think that thing about setting people up, for success, or setting people up potentially to fail, or leaving them in that ambiguous area where they have to make it up for themselves. And therefore, what have they got to draw on to make it up for themselves other than their own experience? I think is one of the areas where we certainly more could be done.
That statistic, that's a third have got less than 5 years service, is it just sort of took me back for a second. Does that mean that turnover is high in police services?
It not particularly, Doug. I mean, there is a level of turnover, but it's not the level of turnover that you would generally see in a lot of professions, because a lot of the time when people join policing, they are mentally committing
Yeah.
to what is now approximately, I think, a 37-year career sort of duration before they retire. As I say, at one time it was 30 years. Um, the way in which kind of that workforce profile changes is because the numbers of police officers do flex, people retire, um, but there's often a sort of a wave effect where certain government policies at a given point in time will have increased police numbers. But when you increase police numbers in a short period of time, that then creates a big um, problem, potentially 30 years on, where those people are actually starting to retire all at the same time.
Mm.
And so you get this sort of waxing and waning effect sort of through the numbers. There's a really interesting sort of thing that the Home Office do, which is twice a year they publish all the data to do with police statistics in terms of workforce statistics. So it's easy accessible data, and for somebody as anarchish as I am, it sort of makes interesting reading. It's an interesting set of statistics, though. Yeah.
You also said that, and I completely agree with this, that 80% of people who move into their first line manager role rarely receive any form of training, or it's minimal. And if that's the case in policing, that is potentially worrying, that they're responsible for other people. It's one thing to train people, though. It's another thing to assess whether they can actually make that step up. Does that happen?
Yeah, there's a really thorough program of assessment in that sense. And so whilst the training might vary very much force by force, there is a thing called the National Police Promotions Framework. And the process of assessing people for readiness for promotion has always been for several decades now quite thorough. So in that arena, um, the sort of the process of demonstrating that they've got the knowledge of law and procedure is done through assessment of psychometrically valid tests of knowledge of law and procedure, the whole system of doing that. And then the behavioral part of are they suited to managing other people is done through a thing called the National Police Promotions Framework. So there's some level of assessment involved in there, and there's some level of workplace portfolio building and development. I think what is the important feature, though, is what causes people to want to be promoted. So as with many, many, many workplaces, one of the only ways to progress financially is through being promoted. So there is progression within roles, but you hit a ceiling quite soon. So getting promoted is quite important if you want to financially sort of progress your kind of career in that sort of sense. And there isn't many specialist routes other than that, in terms of financial terms. So the motivation, are people suited? Are they ready? Are critical things. There is assessment there for that, but there's also a workplace demand, which is actually we need supervisors. We need a certain volume of supervisors to do what needs to be done.
It's interesting you said that there are behavioural assessments, where we obviously work in a sort of an associated area and looking at mental assessments. It's
Yes.
one thing to say whether people behave in the right way or potentially can behave in the right way. It's another thing to say that they are mentally ready and mentally fit to take on an additional role. Does that happen?
Yeah, and I think one of the aspects of that mental readiness to the role is what's the motivation of the individual.
Mhm.
Some of that motivation might come from a desire to want to grow, progress, learn, uh, be goal orientated, to be achievement orientated. But on the other hand, it might actually be, well, this is the only route for me to financially progress. And I think there are very, very clearly different intrinsic and extrinsic motivating factors there, as to whether somebody might be mentally suited and ready to progress.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to explore is as you progress up an organization, the stressors and the pressures are not only greater, but they're different. And so not everybody can adjust. I mean, I'm doing a little bit of a project with a guy in China, and he's identified 7 layers of sort of progression from the bottom to the top of an organization. And it's quite an interesting exercise. I'm not sure there are 7, but what I am aware of is that the stressors and the pressures increase and they're different as you go up. So you need to have a kind of a mindset that can adjust to those and be appropriate for each of those levels. So you've got to be capable of responding appropriately. So I would guess that must be a factor in the police services as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably true across all responder
Yeah,
services,
yeah.
where you move into a supervisory role and that responsibility of I'm now not only just responsible for me, I'm responsible for other people too,
Mm,
puts you into a position where you've got to think not only, well, what would my response be, but what are my responsibilities to these other people? And so I think each time you move up an organizational level, there probably is a greater and greater sort of demand on your resources, and you are spread then more thinly too. And both of those things actually create a greater pressure for individuals. And I think that's where, depending on whether or not the right organizational mechanisms are in place, A, for assessment for progression,
mm,
then once into the role, the development within role, not only for the individual to be able to do the role, but also to be able to do the role in the way that's supportive of what the organizational culture is trying to achieve too. And then once they are in that position, are they able to be sufficiently agile to respond to a whole host of, and
mm,
I think this is where first responder services are really interesting, because the level of ambiguity about, well, what might come in today is huge, and so that ability to be able to respond and react in the moment in a way which is taking care of themselves and doing the
mm.
right things by themselves, but taking care of other people and doing the right things by other people, because a lot of the people into those services actually do want to genuinely make a difference to society, and that set of expectations I think is quite challenging. And then there's the external expectation, the external scrutiny, the external political environment, the media reporting, and people within policing do feel um, a sense of a responsibility to do the right thing by the public, but they also feel often quite hurt when things don't go well, or when there's what they see as unjustified criticism. And I think that's reasonable. And those are all pressures that they're trying to process and deal with, while also trying to do quite a demanding job.
Right. I mean, if you were to look at, say, TV series about policing, you get a picture of everybody's pretty tough, and the higher up the organisation, people shout a lot at each other, and there's this impression that it's a pretty tough environment. And I suspect it probably is. Um, and you said that what happens in the policing and first responding services is not necessarily different to a lot of other sectors. So we do a lot of work in professional services, and I would say they're also incredibly tough. There's very little tolerance or understanding of people who are more mentally sensitive and so on. Is that a feature in policing or first responder services?
I'd say yes and no. I think the sort of the television characterization of what it might be like to be in policing um, doesn't sort of take into account that this is a workforce of over 240,000 people. And so for every slightly shouty supervisor or manager you might get, there's probably a range of other people taking a very different approach, and there is quite a lot of leadership development work within policing. So the work the College of Policing does under Sir Andy Marsh is really important in that space. Trying to get the culture right, trying to get the tone right, and trying to support people. But yes, I'm sure that other type of bullying behavior, I've heard many cases of that. Overbearing behavior, I've heard many cases of that. And so I do think there is a level of environmental reasons why being mentally tough is probably a benefit within a policing or first responder context. But I do also think there's quite a lot of people in a 240,000 population who are going to be mentally sensitive. And this is where I'm not sure whether or not people can take that idea of the transactional analysis, individualized consideration, and the drive down the diversity, equity, and inclusion sort of principle of let's not treat people as homogenous sort of ideas of units, but let's try and treat them according to what their individual needs are. There is an awful lot of that. How well people do that is probably pretty varied, though. Being mentally sensitive in a first responder context, though, probably does put people at a greater risk of adverse reaction to some challenging situations. However, I think it's not just down to the individual. I think it's down to the support services, the work design, and the environmental factors that are all going to play a part in that as well. And there's a series of more interconnected responsibilities, I think, there too.
And I was thinking there as well, where I suppose you want a realistic level of confidence in one's own abilities and sense of how much they can control the situation and stuff like that, I suppose, because obviously they're key components of mental toughness. But when you mentioned earlier, Gordon, about like so much ambiguity in terms of what you're stepping into, I'm just picturing these people looking at, 3 or 4 years into a career, taking on significant responsibility in something that's already highly unpredictable. It would be easy to see how, on one hand, people might underestimate the impact they can have in a positive way, but equally, I suppose, because it's not easy to know what you're able to do. So you kind of just have to guess and see if you're right. And
Yeah,
I
you're
guess,
probably right there, John. I think one of the things about that is um, having a reasonable level of self-efficacy is probably really important because it's not like you're asking to learn a series of processes. Clearly, there's a whole series of processes that sit behind what people do. But when somebody's in a dynamic situation and in a situation that they didn't predict that morning when they got out of bed they were going to be in, feeling like you've got some level of confidence in your ability to deal with it, even if you might be slightly anxious about is this going to go okay or not. But the ability, that confidence to be able to step into that rather than step away from it becomes, I think, really important because, as it's often said, the likes of our ambulance service, fire service, and police officers are the people who run towards danger when the rest of us are running in the other direction. And I think that is important because they have a huge sense of public duty and public responsibility. But if you have that and it's not matched with a reasonable level of self-efficacy and confidence in your ability to deal with unpredictable events and potentially unpredictable people, then that's going to make that just that little bit harder.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in this kind of because sometimes when people talk about self-belief, confidence, efficacy type concepts, they're really thinking of a specific situation. Whereas I suppose certainly what we do in the research that we cover it's a kind of confidence that you have in yourself, not in the situation. I can't remember who the quote was, and I'll probably screw it up. But the bird sitting in the tree isn't afraid of the branch breaking because its belief isn't in the strength of the branch; it's in its own wings, kind of thing. It's that sense of you can do all the training drills and these hypothetical scenarios, but actually your confidence isn't in, oh, I've done this exact drill, so as long as that turns up, I'll be okay. Your confidence is in myself. When stuff is not going how we expected it to go, I back myself to do, and I don't even know what it is, but I back myself to do whatever the best thing to do in that moment is. And it's
I do wonder if in that, John, there's a thing about having found yourself sort of growing through unpredictable events that you never thought you might be in.
hmm,
Um, and those in some sort of ways building up over time, that that sort of idea that, well, actually I've dealt with something that was a bit unpredictable. And now on reflection would back myself to deal with something which is unpredictable. It sort of grows over time. I think one of the challenges in first responder environments, though, is you can't be guaranteed that on your first day of a job, you won't go to something which is really pretty catastrophic, highly traumatic, and hugely demanding. And therefore you can't ease yourself in just in quite the same sort of way. Because something that's true, I think, of many first responders is the call that they get through from the control center to say, look, go to this event, might seem on the face of it pretty straightforward.
yeah,
It's only when they get there and find out a little bit more that it can become highly complex. I was talking to an officer just recently who was talking about having gone to what seemed like a really straightforward arrest somebody who's in a property with a warrant, not a problem. They were well resourced, they were well trained, they're deployed. As soon as they walked through the door of this property, first thing they heard was a baby's cry. Changed everything
yeah,
because of what they call the markers on the individual. They knew that there was potential for firearms, for other weaponry in the house, and they were then stepping into a house to arrest somebody who potentially might use firearms or weaponry, and there's a baby present, and it just changed the whole dynamic. And it's that sort of unpredictability, I think, for people that becomes really important. But in that instance, as is the case for many police officers, what then I heard them describe in terms of what they did, gives you every reassurance that some of these people are just, they are day-to-day superheroes,
hmm.
genuinely day-to-day superheroes, some fabulous people who take care of us.
A couple of things you mentioned there, Gordon, that just sort of really resonated was uh, the development through experience and reflection. And we get this a lot when we're talking about whatever kind of skills it might be, about how people handle stressful situations. And people always, I always find people kind of want this quick fix. Are you going to do a workshop? And then because you've done this workshop, you've learned to take a few breaths, you'll be fine. Like, but to me, that's the reality, that any workshop, any of that kind of stuff that's that's trying to explore yourself, understand how you react, be able to sort of separate, cognitions and emotions and stuff. But then really it's when you're in that experience, how do you then link that learning and reflection with the experience? And that's the thing that's going to see somebody become um, a, a, a greater superhero, I suppose, in time. And is the training that people would get in that, it, does it allow that time and understanding of self and reflection, or is there a bit of quick fix
Yeah,
mentality?
I mean, there's a variety of things. I think the answer in policing is because it's such a huge
Mm,
of organized set of organizations, and there's such diversity within that in terms of roles. It's probably not one answer to all of that. I think what I would say is that in highly specialized roles where there's clear high risk, the systems and processes of support that are designed on the back of that are probably pretty comprehensive. Um, and some of that is not only about individual response, but it's about collective response as well. So things like trauma incident risk management, the TRIM process, of collective debriefing, making sense of situations, I think, as you described, John, is probably really important. And what I don't think there's as much of in that space is how to mentally reframe. Some of the principles maybe from cognitive behavioral therapy almost, about sort of emotional reaction, behavioral reaction, physiological reaction, and bringing all of that together with the thinking patterns that happen and how we can use that. I think there might be more scope to use those, but there is a general sense of overall support and a move towards trying to care more for the workforce. And one of the things that is in place, which is developed under the College of Policing and has a lot of input from a guy called Ian Hesketh, is something called Oscar Kilo, which is maybe the phonetic language for okay. And there's a whole series of well-being, resilience, and support systems there for individuals, teams, and organization level, in a whole variety of ways. One of the critical things I think about that is but what's the environmental factor about? What does it say, and how well do I feel I can say, actually, I'm not okay, particularly given as going back to Doug, your characterization of how some of this looks on TV, because people do enter policing with a mindset of, well, what do I think this is going to be like? And that can almost be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Do people feel like they can genuinely speak up and say, actually, I'm not okay and I do need some help and support? And I've found many instances where that is the case. I've found many instances where that's not the case as well. So it's probably one of those things where there's a lot of time and effort going into trying to make that better. But is it where it needs to be for all people all of the time? Probably not. And is that realistic? Well, it might not be realistic, but the effort to move forward in that area is still really important.